Bonjour, comment ça va, monsieur? And
Bonjour, ça
we
va bien?
and I'm speaking in
Wait.
French
Oh, right.
because this was an era when England was conquered by the French. And I often categorize history into two different types of writing history. I guess there's a third. The three ways you can write history are you have historic demographic trends, where this is what I do the most, where I've talked about the macro trends in Western civilization or stuff like the Industrial Revolution or just big multi-century historic things. This is the most underused field. I wish we did more. Then you have the great man epic model of history, which is talking about figures like Napoleon or World War II or Alexander the Great. And then this field is traditionally the most important over human history. But at the same time, um, it's been unpopular for the third model of history, which is basically the Marxist BS model. And this model is almost entirely lies, about 85% of it. And it is purely done for the purpose of obfuscating responsibility so that communists can never be held accountable for killing 100 million people. Okay, I'm stepping off my soapbox now. You can watch my other videos to see why I say that. But our current model of history is Marxist. But the problem with each of these models is that it leaves out certain historic time periods that are incredibly important, but don't fit into either of those frames. And medieval England is one of those time periods where you could argue that the Anglo-Saxons or the ethnic English, of which Austin and I are both part, are the most important ethnicity in history. And they created their cultural identity, their politics, their language, their legal code, their entire society. Every single thing in our social structure is a medieval invention. And I can explain more of that. And so you look at medieval England, and medieval England was a population from between 1 to 4 million people, which is really small. But this tiny population in the northwest of Europe, the cultural fermenting that occurred during it resulted in one of the biggest flowerings ever in human history. And I want to draw attention to medieval England to be a sort of inspirational case for, yes, your random obscure country, if you figure out your social code, can become the most important nation in history. And I love using the word arguable because the great thing about the word arguable is I can disagree with you, but I think it's a reasonable case. Where, for example, I say of the most important ethnicity in history, I'd say it's arguable between the English, and I include the Americans in the English, the Chinese, the Italians, the Greeks, or the Jews. There's probably one I'm forgetting. But I'd argue for each of those. I think they're all within an arguable range. And this is a weird tangent, but I would love if we established a mental categorization. And this is one of the philosophic breakthroughs I want to make of establishing philosophy based upon probabilistic bets. And so we have a 60% probability of this being true. There's a 40%. We can agree that we don't really know, but then we can operate on probability and then establish the probability as a way to figure out how the world works.
I like that because the world works in a probabilistic manner
Yes.
in which
Yes.
there's distributions of likely outcomes, and then creatures distribute along those outcomes to kind of spread
Yeah.
their bets. Like when
When
you're,
I
yeah,
when I
feeding with animals and humans as well. Yeah.
when I meditate, the way I see that God sees the world is like water, where everything flows together and everything's connected, and yet all things have a range where we have free will inside that range, and there's more or less probabilistic outcomes, and the time just flows like water, with each individual choice adding up to an entire universe flowing over time. Um, but that's not here nor there. And the way I see medieval England is, as I said before, it's an era of history that you would not notice was. I compare it often to ancient Israel. Ancient Israel was this completely obscure society. It was like half the size of New Jersey. And yet this society founded the most important religion in world history. And most people in the world are Abrahamics, and all Abrahamic philosophies are ultimately from a Jewish origin. People kill you for saying that, but it's factually true. And so let me get started with medieval England. So I've read a lot of histories of England. I think it's the area of the world. I think England. I once made a map of the areas of the world I've read the most about, and the place in the world I've read the most about is England in the north of France. And so Every history of England starts with Julius Caesar's invasion in 50 BC, and out of pure Celtic spite, I will instead put it at 410. If you want to read the Roman conquest of Britain, go on Wikipedia. I refuse to. And the Romans pulled out of Britain because the empire was falling apart. And late Rome was this decaying, socialist, autocratic, theocratic command economy. Everything libertarians hate was what Rome was in the 5th century. It is the apogee of everything libertarians dislike. And
Yes.
Rome, they stopped having kids, they stopped building cities out, they stopped having trade, and they were just in free fall. And the thing with the fall of Rome is that it was this gradual process until it wasn't, because Rome was fighting all these Germanic barbarian tribes that couldn't really take down the empire. So it was 1,000 maggots eating a corpse. And then what happened was that after centuries of civil war and decay and that stuff, the empire just lost the ability to fight back. And then barbarians smashed into the empire's borders, just raiding cities and turning themselves into basically new countries that the Romans literally gave away their own lands to the barbarians because they couldn't hold on to it. And they would use barbarians to fight other barbarians. And so what happened in 410, because in 400, and watch the Fall of Rome video, the Huns smashed the Germans west. And so the Vandals, the Alans, and the Swabies, 3 German tribes, crossed into France. And Britain was a relatively unimportant state for Britain. Britain was to the Roman Empire what Alaska is to America. It was this completely obscure place that they held for some kind of strategic gain that the Romans lost money on because it was so expensive to occupy. And so the Romans just said, sorry guys, we're leaving now. And they pulled out all their troops. And one of the worst things here is that the Roman garrison in Britain had become this hereditary caste, where it was people who had lived in Britain for generations. So they were pulling out soldiers who had been British for over a century at least and bringing them back to fight in France. And this is such a crazy moment in history because the Roman Empire had pacified the populations it's in of. We're leaving the Pax Romana, or the 200-year period, when there were basically no major wars in the known world, or only a handful. And the Roman Empire stretched from Scotland at Hadrian's Wall, which I've been to, it's relatively cool, then out to Arabia. And with this, the British thought, wait, we haven't had to fight for ourselves for 400 years. Because keep in mind, the Romans had held on to Britain for as long as between us and Queen Elizabeth's reign. And so this forced Roman Britain into a free fall, and it's very much apocalyptic, where overnight was the collapse of complete governance. And Britain was the place where the Roman Empire fell the hardest, where they lost literacy, they lost Christianity, they lost cities, they lost the ability to build in stone. It was almost complete civilizational collapse in Britain, which is not what happened in the Mediterranean region or even most of France. The fall of Rome wasn't that bad per se in a lot of Europe. But then this created a spiraling effect where there was no clear leadership, and the people called the Romano-Britons, which you'll only hear about related to King Arthur, generally historically, the Romano-Britons started facing attacks from 3 different populations. You have the Scotti, and the Scotti were what the original term for the Irish were. And you'll see why as this video continues. Then you have the Picts in Scotland, and then you have the Saxons in North Germany. And so the way the map of the British Isles at the time of the fall of the Roman power was you had the region of modern England and Wales, and the border between the occupied the border between the occupied English region and the Free Scotland was basically the same border as between England and Scotland today. Newcastle flipped, where Newcastle's now English and it was Scottish then. But so you had the Romano-Britons in that region. Ireland and Scotland were never conquered by Rome. And this is a big reason why they are one of the very few surviving places in Europe that are Celtic. Because the Celts used to run all of Europe from Turkey and Romania and Ukraine out the Atlantic fringe, like Brittany and Ireland. And they never unified into countries. They were these wild tribes who had these insanely aggressive warrior cultures where in their culture, you had to die gloriously in battle, and the more gloriously you died in battle, the more glorious your reincarnation was. And life is a never-ending, beautiful pageant of war and struggle. And so the Irish and the Irish, you can forget the Irish-Scottish distinction now. I'm just going to call them the Irish. The Irish and the Picts raided into Britain, and Britain had no idea what to do or how to fight. So they recruited Saxons from England, sorry, Saxons from the north of Germany, where modern Germany, Netherlands, Denmark wasn't conquered by the English either. And there's this region in around modern Copenhagen called the Sund, and this is called the Fountain of Nations by Roman authors, because the area around the Sund, where Denmark meets Sweden, is where the Germanic peoples started. And the Romans were constantly fighting the Germans, where the Germans had the whole northern frontier against the Romans from Romania to the Netherlands. And they came out from the region around Denmark, and in the period before this had conquered most of continental Europe from the Celts. And the area around Denmark just kept spawning out around 20 different ridiculously aggressive barbarian tribes that kept attacking outwards. And the three peoples that came to England, the Angles, the Saxons, and the Jutes, they were called swamp peoples, and they worshipped the pagan gods like Thor and Odin, and they're culturally and genetically identical to Vikings. And they were invited to come to England in order to protect against the Picts and the Irish. And they had already raided England for centuries beforehand. Keep in mind, Rome's collapse was a really slow burn process where it took centuries of gradual degradation for Rome to fall. And the Irish and the Scots got really far. They raided across the entirety of England, where you had Scottish armies outside London, or Pictish armies, as in a distinction that will matter in the future. You had Pictish armies raid deep into South England. And the leader of the Romano-Britons, or one of their most important tribal leaders, was named Vortigern. And my father is Irish, and he loathes Vortigern. My father has brought up Vortigern at least 36 times in my childhood as an example of an ethnic traitor. He said, quote, "If Vortigern wasn't there, the Celts would still run Britain." And Vortigern was a, quote, traitor to our people. But Vortigern invited the Saxons over, and then he refused to pay them, which is kind of a stupid move when you're fighting against these basically unhinged Vikings. And then the Saxons immediately took the eastern third of England. And modern English culture stems from the Angles, the Saxons, and the Jutes settling in the east of England, where the Jutes are from modern Jutland in Denmark. Then the Angles are from the area around Schleswig-Holstein in North Germany. And then the Saxons are from modern Saxony. And they all moved over, and the Jutes settled in Kent, making the Kingdom of Kent. Then you had a variety of other Anglo-Saxon kingdoms between... You had Lindsey in modern Lincolnshire. You had Essex, Sussex, Wessex, Bernicia, Northumbria, etc. And so what happened here is that the Anglo-Saxons had taken the eastern third of England, and then they butted up against King Arthur. Do you have any questions before I get into King Arthur and the Anglo-Saxon colonization itself?
Yes. So King Arthur, basically, the way those myths are, the two main points of the myths are a way to translate the insights from the classical world imprinted through Rome onto a local Britannic
Interesting.
frame. So
Explain.
basically, they're taking ownership of those ideas. So King Arthur is kind of like this mythical kingdom that pops out of nowhere, and it's super enlightened.
Huh.
Kind of like how Graham Hancock talks about Göbekli Tepe.
Yeah, yeah.
They built these pyramids out of this agricultural society, etc. So it's like an infusion that they made their own through those myths.
Yes.
And then the other element of the story is, like you said with your dad, Celtic infighting and the
Yeah.
attempt to unify against the Anglo-Saxon invasions. So I guess my question is your comment on them working with the Anglo-Saxons to fight the Picts is kind of counter to that Arthurian narrative of them fighting the Saxons, but also consistent in the aspect of their
Yes.
failure to unite.
There's multiple points there. My father would say growing up, the Welsh lost their Celt card due to losing so hard for the English, and because the Welsh used to run all of England, and so I don't think anyone knows whether King Arthur existed or not. I refuse to have a definite opinion because the evidence is just not there. Like there are no sources on this time period on either 300 side. For the next 300 years, there's basically no sources.
Right. Well, yeah, go ahead.
And so my attitude here is if I had to make a probabilistic bet, I would say there was probably a leader like him, because we know that there was a 50-year period when the Romano-Britons were able to hold back the Saxons, and that had to come from somewhere. But my guess is he was probably a relatively obscure local warlord that they piled all these legends onto to make him awesome. Because I've read like 4 or 5 Arthurian legends. I took a course in Arthurian legends in college, and they make King Arthur run all of the British Isles and France and Germany and Scandinavia, and they make him this enlightened court, and there's no way that happened. And I think saying there was no King Arthur is as much a leap of faith as saying that there was a King Arthur, because we just have no evidence. And my attitude here is kind of like the Bible, where there's all this debate in the book of Genesis. Given we have no evidence at all, I will take a relatively improbable legend as the slight amount of evidence we have.
Yes, and the role he played is pretty clear. And it relates to your comment earlier about this being kind of a collapse of society
Yeah.
and a dark age. I mean, there was an archaeological collapse of record keeping, but in terms of the elite, and there were the wars, right, which
Yeah.
disrupted everything. But in terms of the actual continuation of the ideas, those were maintained fairly consistently throughout a lot of the elite
Yes.
at the time, which hence why the Arthurian kingdoms were so quote unquote enlightened.
Yes. There's another element here that King Arthur myths didn't really exist in England before the Norman conquest. And an irony here is the King Arthur myth stems from Brittany. And I have a soft spot for the Breton, them being Celts in France. And the Normans, who we'll talk about later, they got King Arthur from the Breton, and when the Normans or the North French conquered England, they used the King Arthur myth to justify why the Anglo-Saxon conquest wasn't justified, because they could say, because a lot of the Norman conquest was done by people who were ethnically Breton, so the Breton were able to say, we are justifiably reconquering England from the Saxon conquerors because this land belongs to King Arthur and the Britons.
So who said that? Who co-opted the Arthurian legend?
It was the Norman conquerors, because the Norman conquerors, they wanted to invalidate the Anglo-Saxon conquest of England, and they were working with a lot of people who were ethnically Breton, so they could play the card, we are the Britons rightfully reconquering
Right.
Britain in the name of Arthur.
That's the story of both the Normans and the Anglo-Saxons constantly trying to pretend that they're British and represent the island. And
Yes, yes.
and even in English history, there's like a kind of a memory wipe over the Anglo-Saxon period. It's like Roman right to Anglo-Saxon,
Yes.
and that's kind of what is England.
Yes.
Because this Arthurian period was fairly short. And like, it's funny, your dad called that guy a traitor, because a big theme of the Arthurian legends are interpersonal relations and conflict and infighting, because that was the story of trying to unite the Celts. And then it had a bad ending. Yeah.
Reading historic legends really does hammer home the Uncle Ted point, where Uncle Ted said that basically modern civilization is completely depersonalizing so that we have no reason to live. And if you read out King Arthur or the other similar medieval legends like Charlemagne or Siegfried or ancient Egyptian or Greek mythology, it's all about personal family struggles and is about friends hanging out. And so their entire concept of government is a bunch of buddies hanging out, drinking and squabbling. And you can tell that it's a significantly more personal society, where religion was so important in that society because literally everything was about an interpersonal relationship. So you needed your relationship with God as a way of basically wiping out conflict between interpersonal relationships. And When I was a child, I watched this documentary made in like 2005, which said the Anglo-Saxon invasions never happened. And I thought, that is the most stunningly stupid thing I've ever heard. And this is an example of leftist revisionist history, where, for example, the leftists said the Aryan invasions never happened. They said that everyone left Africa and there were no wars in between. They said tribal peoples are peaceful. And they said that English started speaking a Germanic, the English started speaking a Germanic language through peaceful transfer of ideas. And I thought, you idiot, that never happens. Languages spread because someone conquered someone else. I'm not just going to start speaking Spanish because a lot of Latino people moved here. That's not how this works.
Right. Brooches and things can cross
Yeah,
boundaries.
exactly. And we have genetic data on this, and the genetic data is such a good rebutting of leftist revisionist history, where now we know that the Aryan invasions happened. We know that Ice Age Europe was genocided 7 times over. We know that biological race and sex and stuff is real. This is all stuff we know. And with the Anglo-Saxon conquest, we found consistently that England is a single genetic pool that is Anglo-Saxon. The English are about half Germanic ancestry, half Celtic. And the father's side's more Germanic and the mother's side's more Celtic. Because what happened is the Anglo-Saxon men came over, they killed the men, and then married the women. And this resulted in the English being a single gene pool. In the area, my dad's side's Irish, my mom's side's English. My mom's English ancestry is from the area around Cheshire and York in the Danelaw. That area is Danish ancestry. So I get a lot of Danish ancestry in my Ancestry.com and my True Ancestry. Well, meanwhile, the Celts are like 20 different genetic pools. If you look at the genetic map of England, you find that there's 20 different Celtic populations. And then there's 2 different Germanic populations. And you can see the history of England afterwards, that this single large English genetic group is basically dominating the rest of these disunited Celtic genetic groups.
Right. Right. And another way that the Anglo-Saxons kind of tried to claim origin historically is, well, King Arthur was associated with Christianity. So they were also Christian, and the original Anglo-Saxon invaders were all pagan.
Yeah.
And then they became Christianized and were like, hey, we're defending Christianity against the Norse invaders.
Yes. Yes. So Christianity is a good point, because whenever you talk about the Middle Ages, you have to talk about Christianity because it's the most pivotal thing in their civilization. If you look at medieval Europe and you can't understand Christianity, you'll have no idea what's going on, which is why we have no good comprehension of medieval history in our society, or why we think the Middle Ages was a backwater, because we don't want to have to think about an advanced Christian society. And so the Anglo-Saxons were pagans. They worshipped gods like Odin and Thor that the Vikings worshipped. And Christianity barely survived in England. Because the Welsh are the Britons, or the indigenous inhabitants of England, who are pushed west into the hills. And they called themselves Britons, and they moved down to Brittany in France, populating that. And they called it, that's why it's called Brittany, Little Britain. And then some of them went to the northwest of Spain. And so they remained Christian, but they lost contact with the Church of Rome, where they kind of just degenerated into becoming a very localized church. And then what happened is something very interesting, where St. Columbo was this Welsh guy who was captured by Irish pirates and brought to Ireland, and then he converted all of Ireland's population to Christianity. And this brought about a brief golden age for Ireland that my fellow Irish will never shut up about, where this era of history occurred with Ireland was still this tribal, warlike backwater society, but it was the intellectual hub of Europe, which is a weird contrast, where the Irish became the most advanced intellectuals and artists and religious thinkers of anywhere in Europe, because they weren't attached to the falling Roman Empire. And so Ireland had this brief, beautiful golden age where Irish monks actually restructured Christianity. And so when the French or the Germans or the English brought in Christian experts and intellectuals, they used the Irish. And the Celts issue in general is the Celts can't unify because their hyper-individualistic culture means that you constantly get with slights of honor and that stuff. And this is how I live too, so I'm not even going to criticize it. But what happens is that, for example, the Welsh could never unify. The Irish could never unify. They were constantly stuck in internecine warfare, and the Scots could only barely unify, and only the Germanic-speaking parts of Scotland could unify. So the Celts were always forced onto the defensive against the Germanic peoples. And so Ireland was not able to use its golden age responsibly, where it just stayed in intertribal warfare. And Ireland had they had mass polygamy, where people like my ancestor Niall of the Nine Hostages has 6 to 7 million descendants because he slept with so many women. Or Cuchulainn, son of the Hound, founder of the O'Connor line, he had millions of descendants too. Same thing with Alastair of the Isles, a Scottish 12th century warlord, where if we've actually done Y chromosome analysis with people with Irish last names and Scottish last names, they all share a single ancestor. And I'm from the Northeast, so I know a lot of these people. So every Sullivan you know is descendant from some guy 2,000 years ago. And Ireland actually has the oldest last names of any country in Europe, where, for example, my last name Lynch is Gaelic for Olanchon, which is son of a fisherman. And I know that my ancestors, before they came to America in the 1800s, were fishermen. So were my ancestors fishermen for 2,000 years straight? That's just ridiculous to think about. And
Right.
the Irish then converted Scotland, where the Irish actually conquered Scotland, where the Scotti were originally the Irish, and then they moved into Western Scotland, founded the kingdom of, I believe, it's not Strathclyde, it's not Eltclud, it's not Galloway. I'm forgetting the exact name. They formed the Kingdom of Scotland. No, that's the name. Exactly. That's too easy. And then Scotland, over the centuries, gradually unified the country of Scotland into a single homogeneous country. And so the Irish conquered Scotland from the indigenous population, the Picts. And Scotland eventually became a unified country centuries later. But the Irish also converted the north of England to their version of Christianity. And so what happened over time is that in the 600s, the church, the Catholic Church, which had survived in the continent, they reconverted the South English to Catholicism. And societies in the Middle Ages, once they had bureaucracy, they have to pick at least one of the major monotheistic religions. So the second the English had to grow up to form independent, self-governing societies, they in turn had to convert to Christianity, because you have to get the monks who can read. The only people who could read at this time period were monks. You had to get the monks who could read to keep the documents. You had to get a moral code where you aren't constantly killing people over honor disputes and that sort of thing, to have a larger bureaucratized, organized capitalist society. And the story goes that the Pope at the time in Rome, he saw some slaves and he said, "These slaves are very attractive. Who are they?" And they said, "Oh, we call them Angles." And he said, "I think you mean angels, since they're so attractive. We should convert them."
Wow,
And
smooth Pope.
exactly, popes were allowed to have sex at the time, but the I don't want to misconstrue that content. I know if I say that context is sexual, I will have 1,000 nerds hating me. So I'm going to leave it blank. So the South English converted to Catholicism and the North English converted to Irish Christianity. And they had a rapprochement where the Irish church integrated with the Catholic Church. And there was a big strife about the date of Easter, where there was a North English queen who was married to a South English king, and they would practice two different Easters, but then eventually it all integrated together.
That's interesting. And one of the things I heard about the period was England and Ireland, and this could explain Ireland's flourishing with the ideas, were one of the only European places who didn't have a Latin-based language.
Yes.
And so when they translated the Bible, it was done through, they were able to do really good, pure literary analysis
Yes.
without having any cultural hangups in terms of the arguments over the meaning of words as attached to
Interesting.
words contemporarily used, and
Yeah.
had a particular charge for
Yeah.
their culture.
That's an interesting idea because Mediterranean Europe really struggled with that. The Byzantines had multiple civil wars about the meaning of the word iota. And
Right.
and the whole thing about like was Christ divine at the moment of resurrection or for his whole life or was he never divine? And it's hilarious to read the Bibles that were written for the Germanic peoples like the Anglo-Saxons where they would literally structure Christianity in a way where they would talk about the God of the Jews being a mighty warrior who crushed his enemies, and they would talk about the Jews swearing oaths of fealty to their Lord, that being God.
Right.
And you can tell this is an incredibly warlike society where the old gods like Thor and Odin, the ultimate aim of a man's life is to die gloriously in battle, and glory was the meaning of life. And so we're entering a probably pretty important but boring period as England solidified into set kingdoms. And so from the period from, let's say, 600 until 850, you see England's gradual integration into a series of larger kingdoms, such as Wessex and the southwest of England. Then you have East Anglia. Kent got consumed by Wessex. In the 800s, you have Mercia in the middle of England, and then you have Northumbria. And then in Scotland, you saw the formation of Strathclyde, inhabited by Britons, Scotland, and Pictland, where England was a series of different kingdoms, and then the Welsh and the Irish were still disunified. And the English had colonized they colonized all of modern England at this point. And then the big historic defining period that created England happened, that being the Viking invasions, where starting in the 790s, leading until the 1060s, the Vikings who came from Scandinavia just raped England. It's hard to watch at times because the Vikings constantly attacked every single crevice of England, and they constantly kept on trying to because England's an island with a lot of rivers. You can go anywhere in England with a boat. And
Right.
it started out with the destruction of the Lindisfarne Monastery in the north of England, which was an Irish-style monastery. And for the first 50 years, the Vikings largely just raided around England, trying to steal stuff from it and hurting
And I would
monasteries.
say a small caveat to that, because sometimes it's portrayed like in
Yeah.
the show Vikings, where they kind of just stroll up on England and they
Yeah.
happen to, hit the coast right next to
Oh,
this
I
beautiful
hate that thing.
monastery. And then they're like, wow, look at all these riches that are
Yeah.
undefended. In reality, they had been trading with
Yeah.
England for
Yeah.
hundreds of years. They knew where those monasteries were.
Yes.
They knew where everything was. There were Atlantic trade networks going back to the Neolithic, like
Exactly.
6,000 years ago.
I'm
Um,
so I'm
yeah.
so gl-
So, yeah, go ahead. Go ahead.
I'm so glad you brought that up because I've watched the Viking TV show and that caused me so much physical pain I stopped watching the show. Because in the Vikings TV show, first of all, the Vikings wear leather jackets and stuff, which is not historically accurate. And then secondarily, they act as if the Vikings discovered England in the 790s, which is such
Right.
a ludicrously stupid point that they didn't need to put in there.
The
Where,
English Channel is not very long. And
yeah,
they didn't, we couldn't travel long distances, but we had the technology to travel coastlines for
yes.
thousands of years.
You can sail from Norway to Scotland in less than 2 days with
Yep.
their technology.
And we
Um,
don't hear about those Atlantic trade networks because most of our history is recorded
yes,
history
yes.
is Mediterranean.
We
And
can
they were
do
pinned in that area, like we
we
talked about earlier.
we can do ancient Europe for the next episode if you'd like.
Oh, that could be interesting.
Yeah. But the so the Vikings raided around, and it's crazy to say the Vikings and the Anglo-Saxons didn't know each other because they are so genetically close, you literally cannot distinguish them. Our genetics technology is really advanced now. We know the exact counties people's families came from, but the genetic difference between Danes, Saxons, and English is so close they're completely indistinguishable. And um, and so the area the Vikings attacked first was North Scotland, completely where they completely destroyed the local culture. Where the Vikings took Orkney and they took the Hebrides and these islands in the north of Scotland, and these places spoke Norwegian into the 18th century, where it was such complete cultural dominance. And there was this place called the Kingdom of the Isles, where Norwegian Vikings took the region stretching from north of Scotland, those islands, um, down through the Isle of Man. Then they took parts of Ireland and parts of the northwest of England, and there was this Viking Norwegian axis around the northern seas of the British Isles. And the Vikings held on to the north of Scotland into the 1200s, even mainland North Scotland. And across Europe, the Vikings forced Europe to become vastly better to fight them off. Because when you face threats, if you are strong, the threats make you stronger. And if you are weak, the threat makes you weaker. And so Europe passed the test by the Vikings forcing them to be better, because the modern French, English, and Scottish monarchies all stem from fighting the Vikings. The Scottish monarchy was the Scottish leader Kenneth MacAlpin, who unified most of modern Scotland by conquering the Picts and the the old Scottish region. And Scotland actually unified before England did. And then in England, what happened is that you had the Great Danish Invasion, where Norwegian Vikings went to Ireland and Scotland, the Danes went to England. And in the 860s, the Danes just brought a huge army and smashed across England really quickly. There's a really cool book series called, it's by Bernard Cornwell, and it's the Uhtred of Bamberg series. It's really fun to read until like book 5 when it gets repetitive. But they took out every major English kingdom except Wessex. And this is one of those either will of God or really lucky die roll moments where Wessex happened to have the best king in English history, who was Alfred the Great. And when you look at modern England, you are seeing Alfred the Great's creation, where Alfred the Great was king of Wessex, and the Danes nearly knocked out Wessex, and if they did, they would have taken all of England. But he was forced to wage a guerrilla campaign in the southwest of England, and with his guerrilla forces, he was able to launch ambush attacks on the Danes to drive them out of Wessex. And so he was able to fight this last-ditch victory. And the reason that London is the capital of England is because Wessex later became the most important English nation that unified the country. And so over the next century, Wessex gradually pushed the Vikings back north. And you wonder, if the Vikings conquered England in that time period, England would just be a Scandinavian country. We would be speaking something really close to Danish. We would just be Scandinavians. And I can't overstate Alfred the Great's excellence, because he established the modern English monarchy structure. He established their education system. He established a fortification structure, a military structure. He created modern England nearly single-handedly.
Didn't he create the Navy as well?
Yes.
That being a key way to stop the Vikings, because the way that the Vikings conquered areas, it wasn't just raiding in and out. They would develop a series of coastal forts, and that way they would be able to move their armies, which were smaller, more quickly along the coastline from fort to fort. And so they were able to, with a smaller population, always, have bigger armies.
That is correct. The Vikings' biggest strategic advantage was their naval ability, which let them attack anywhere. And they were also ferocious warriors. So York became the flower of the Viking Danelaw, where Danes settled in the area that became the north of England. And a lot of them became my ancestors, because that was the area where my family's from. And the Danes actually established more free-thinking, free-farming populations, because they established cultures of basically independence from established feudalism. Didn't exist by this point, but you still had more income inequality, and the culture of the American Midwest actually stems from this part of England. The whole Midwestern attitude of mind your own business and keep to your guns and that stuff, it comes from this part of England due to the Danish colonization. And York became the second most important city in England, and York was the center of this trade network that stretched from North America out to Central Asia. And it was a huge area of the slave trade, because the Vikings sold lots of Irish and English slaves to other populations. And there's a not low chance York would have become the capital of England in this time period. London wasn't even the capital of Wessex. Winchester was, but London was still the biggest city. And Wessex pushed the Danes north over the course of a century. And they, under the leader, I believe, Athelstan, they were able to finally reunify all of England. And there was the Great Battle of Brunanburh, where the Scots and the Kingdom of the Isles unified to fight against the English. And the English won a Pyrrhic or a bear victory at Brunanburh, but everyone died so much that it was seen as this horrifying battle that destroyed everyone for a generation. And the thing that came out of this, though, was a unified England and a unified Scotland. And so the Viking invasions had literally forced the British Isles to unify into set kingdoms. And this nearly happened in Ireland, where the Vikings held on to power in... the Vikings founded every major city in Ireland, Dublin, Limerick, Waterford, because they would control the local coasts. And they were unable to take the interior because the Irish were completely demented warriors. The Vikings kept on saying the Irish were so difficult to fight, and they were incapable of entering Ireland's interior, much like the European colonization of Africa, where they held forts on the coast, but they couldn't take the interior. And the Irish briefly unified under Brian Boru, who was the king of Munster. And Brian was around 1000 AD, was able to drive the Vikings out of Ireland and briefly unify, but then he died, and then Ireland lost its basically one attempt at unifying.
Right. And interesting. And it was easier, I guess, for them to fight with the Anglo-Saxons and the Irish because it was easier to make treaties, maybe. I mean, they were more like cousins. Like the Dane law didn't it slotted into the Anglo-Saxon
Yeah,
kingdoms. And when we're talking about the unification effect as a result of the
interesting.
Vikings, we're really talking about the Anglo-Saxon kingdoms. Those are what
Yes, yes.
unified. Um, and yeah, it wasn't that big of a deal to adopt some of their legal changes
Huh.
into their legal code because it was
Yeah,
broadly very, very similar. It was like, the Celts are having a picnic, the Saxons show up on the table,
yeah,
and
yeah.
then these other guys come and they start fighting them, but they're cousins. Yeah, so.
Exactly. What I'd also say is that England was just holistically more advanced as a society. England already had cities, it already had tax structures, all that stuff, and Ireland didn't have any of that. And with England, you saw the formation of what became the most stable country in medieval Europe. Because medieval Europe is this constant kaleidoscope of countries falling apart and feudal wars and disunification. And in a lot of ways, that's a really good thing because it decentralized power in Western civilization. But at the same time, England was not that important a country in medieval Europe. It had like 4 million people, and France had 20 million. The Holy Roman Empire had 20 million. Spain had 10 million. But England was able to consistently punch above its weight because it was well unified by the system Alfred had created. And so the English were able to go toe to toe with the French, who had 4 times their population multiple times in the Middle Ages. And I'm really grateful to Alfred for setting that up. And England also, we forget that every country in medieval Europe had a parliament, and England had a parliament going back to the Anglo-Saxon period called the Witenagemot, or the Witenagemot is another version of the all thing, and our parliamentary custom comes from the Anglo-Saxon parliamentary tradition, as does English common law, which comes from the Anglo-Saxon tradition as well. Almost every institution in the modern West stems from medieval England. More of it's from the Norman period, but our concept of marriage, our concept of religion, our concept of binding legal contracts, our concept of employer-employee, our concept of modern science are all medieval institutions. We are the same society as the Middle Ages in most ways. And so medieval England, and the pet peeve here, I really hate how older history writers are so stuck in this progress delusion that loads of these old authors have spoken about how the Normans were fated to conquer England because they were innately superior. Because in the old view of history, if something happens, it has to be progress. But I've really seen
Mhm.
very little evidence that the Normans were significantly technologically superior to the English. But so the Danes had another gasp where under King Canute, they conquered all of modern England, but then Canute had this empire of Denmark, England, and Norway for a single generation. And the TV show The Vinland Saga is really awesome, and it covers this. But Canute's empire fell apart because his children lacked the will to hold it together, and England defaulted back onto the English. Then William the Conqueror was the Duke of the Normans. And the Normans were a Viking population that had settled in the north of France, where they had been raiding Paris. And the French monarchy was actually formed to fight the English. The reason Paris is the capital of France is that the Count of Paris, which was an unimportant place, was the guy who held off the Viking invasions, all the other French nobility. Because France in 1000 AD was Somalia today. It was this constant failed state with warlords and that stuff. And they picked the Count of France because he could never unify the country. But he was a Chad, though he fought off the Vikings. So the Normans were this Viking population in the north of France, and they were pretty badass. They conquered modern Sicily and South Italy, and they conquered Syria with just their buddies who were in, who were, who just happened to be there on mercenary or crusading. And William the Conqueror invaded England, and he wiped out the English army at the Battle of Hastings. And Hastings is an interesting battle because the English lost because William the Conqueror feigned a retreat, and then he pulled the Anglo-Saxon forces off a hill that they were fighting on, and he could slaughter them. Where Hastings is an interesting period in military history because it's an infantry army versus a cavalry army, and it signifies a change in medieval warfare from guys in a shield wall, or the skjoldborg in Danish, with swords and axes and spears fighting against these knights on horseback. And it signifies the rise of knight warfare and also the rise of feudalism and serfdom, where the Normans wiped out the English nobility nearly wholesale and then replaced it with Norman French speakers. And they introduced the system of serfdom and feudalism on top of England, bringing it up to the French system, which caged the English peasantry, forcing them to basically stay on their lord's land while establishing this coherent Norman elite.
Right. And that battle was interesting because for English people will get this, but it was like Arsenal versus Stoke City, where
Huh.
it went on all day, and because the Normans were just constantly attacking,
Yeah,
attacking,
yeah,
attacking, attacking, and the other side was just defending. And there's some dispute about the success of the feigned retreat. It was kind of like was it a feigned retreat? Was it not?
yeah.
But if they had never left their position, yeah, it was at a complete stalemate, and then they came down the hill and got killed.
I have played so many video games of the Battle of Hastings. I played like five. Um, and also, your last name is Norman origin, and I am a descendant from
Right.
the Lord of Dol de Bretagne. The furthest ancestor I can find is the Lord of Dol de Bretagne in 1086, which is on the Norman-Breton border.
Right. So Paget, this came from Page,
Yeah.
which was basically knights' assistants in the army and part of the military
Yes.
um, with the Norman conquests. And the other one way to contextualize the Norman conquests as to show how Viking they were is William the Conqueror was the 8 generations down from Ragnar Lothbrok. And in
Based.
between were many of the most significant Viking figures.
Yes.
So it was literally a 300-year-old family effort.
Yeah.
A lot of the tactics were consistent. You know, the fort building kind of evolved from the coastal
Yes.
building. So yeah, it really was the kind of that was the Vikings' ultimate success over England, except they used a lot of French people and
Yes.
Bretons to do it, and they didn't really have a big genetic impact with that conquest.
Yeah, we've done genetics in the Norman conquerors, and they're 95% Danish ancestry.
Mm,
And the Normans established this ruling class over England, and they did a pretty good job of oppressing the English. The English didn't really fight back that much, and even the Normans peacefully took over Scotland because the King of Scotland is this weird society where the north of it is these tribal warlords that's Gaelic speakers. They were not subjugated until the mid 1700s. The north of Scotland was not fully brought under English control until the same time period as the American Revolution. And south of Scotland became populated by these English settlers who spoke a language called Scots. And they they uh, they became the basis for the Scottish monarchy, and the Scottish monarchy even spoke French. William Wallace was a native French speaker, which we forget. And so the Norman victory over the British Isles was so enormous at some point in the 1200s, where even under Strongbow, the Norman lord, they conquered half of Ireland as well.
Right. They went pretty far in. And then I guess eventually the kingdom split because it was a
Yes.
northern France English unified
Yes.
rule, and I guess their impact was longer lasting ultimately in England than France or
Yes.
Scandinavia.
Yes. 1066 is a very well-known date in English history because it's the last time England saw a real destabilization of its ruling class, where there were two later invasions people forget. There was the French invasion of 1215, and there was the Dutch invasion of 1688. But neither of them actually replaced England's ruling class. And so I have a great board game called Britannia. Britannia is really dope. It simulates all the invasions of Britain between the Roman period and the Norman conquest. And you have to fight 20 different factions to see who wins in England. And it ends at that time period because that's the period when England started to settle together as a nation. It stopped facing real external threats. And London became the capital, and the Normans dominated England, and they established this very chivalric society where their culture was very built upon knightly glory and courtly love and Arthur and romance and that stuff. And it was more French than it was English. England was a cultural colony of France. And you can see that in our language, where I tell people when they write with German words. Like, all of the words for the most crude things like shit, fuck, kill, they're all German words because that was what the peasants spoke. And the words like chivalric or like bourgeois or like beef, the word for the meat itself is French, for the animal is German because the poor people made the animals and the rich ate them. And the kings of England in this time period spent more time in France than they did in England. And one of the great ironies is that there was this period called the Angevin Empire where the dukes of Anjou became the monarchs of England. Anjou is a region south of Normandy. And they married into the ruling family of Aquitaine. Aquitaine was the wealthiest part of France. It was in the southwest. It was one of the most culturally important places in the world due to courtly love and due to the Cathars and due to the Arthurian myths. And so Henry the Second, Henry the Second, and this came after a period of civil war called the Anarchy in the 1100s. He pulled England's together and he established this empire stretching from the Scottish borderlands, half of Ireland, through England down to Spain, because he had the entire western part of France. And the King of France owned an area the size of Delaware around Paris. So the King of France was completely poor, or not completely poor, he was powerless, while the kings of England held half of France. And there was this real period when England had the potential to unify all of France. And Henry II was really a good king. He established English law code. He unified said empire, which was difficult because this is a pre-bureaucracy society. If you have a country, you have to actually ride around it to talk to the noblemen. And his wife Eleanor of Aquitaine was kind of a witch. She was constantly like flirting with other dudes and practicing courtly love and deceit. And she also made a lot of cool art, though, and she poisoned his two sons against him, where his two sons, Richard Lionheart and John Lackland, we'll get to why he's Lackland, but they rebelled against Henry II, where Uh, and this is one of those weird medieval things where your own son rebels against you in war because he wants you to die sooner. And what happened when Henry died is that Richard Lionheart, or Coeur de Lion, inherited the throne, and then Richard Lionheart immediately spent his entire reign going on crusade as an utter Chad move, where he went out to Syria, he fought Saladin, he and Saladin sent each other ice boxes to honor each other, and then he was captured by the Holy Roman Emperor and on his way back and forced to pay an exorbitant fine. And he finally did get back. And the plot of Robin Hood is about this time period. Robin Hood's another figure that we have like very little evidence for. If you want to believe he existed, sure. But England was at this point became ruled by John Lackland, and revisionist historians have tried to rehabilitate him, but they are completely wrong. Where John Lackland was such a bad king, it actually helped England because England had, I think John Lackland might be unironically the worst king in English history. At the same time, the French had their best king in their history, Philip Augustus. When you get the nickname Augustus, you win the game. And so Philip Augustus, in a really short period, took Normandy, the old base, he took Anjou, and then he wiped out everything to the Mediterranean. So France went from the size of Delaware to something like the size of, I don't know, like California. It was a huge jump. And Philip Augustus even invaded England. He got as far north as Lincoln in the middle of England because John Lackland was so hated. The English nobility literally told Philip Augustus to be their king. And what happened is that John Lackland was so abusive that his nobility forced him to sign the Magna Carta. And the Magna Carta is a list of legal privileges that is the origin of Anglo-Saxon political values. And it said that the king couldn't raise taxes without their permission. He couldn't violate their personal rights. And this was done just for the nobility. And almost all of the political protections we have in our society came from medieval nobility. The nobility and the church were the two great protectors of freedom in the Middle Ages. And then over time, England's parliament grew, where Edward the First was actually the king of England who gave parliament the most liberty. And what ended up happening was the king of England would gradually give away more of their power to the parliament to get money to wage war. Because the medieval kings preferred war to governing. So they were happy to give away their governing priorities if they could wage war more. And so what happened is that William Marshall, a distant ancestor of mine, if you research your genealogy, you would also find you had lots of cool ancestors. You just need to put the effort in to study your genealogy, viewer. But
Right.
William Marshall was this just Chad, and he unified the English nation he was this knight who was known for just being the most cool guy, and he drove the French out of England and stabilized England as a country. And Edward the First came after, and he tried to make England conquer the rest of the British Isles, where he conquered Wales, which was a surprisingly difficult process, where they had to build the best castles in history to hold the Welsh down. And then he invaded Scotland, where he nearly conquered Scotland, and he conquered all the lowlands until William Wallace, a relatively obscure West Scottish leader, started launching a guerrilla war against the English. And William Wallace fought admirably, and he was able to briefly drive the English out until the English finally killed him and tortured him in the most horrifying way, passing off to you, Austin.
Oh, well, I suppose that leads right into Robert the Bruce, which they continued that rebellion successfully by neutralizing the castle threat by
Yes.
burning them down, essentially, because there were a lot of castles built. They were using them, but they couldn't outcompete with the English siege, which
Yes.
nullified their castle advantage. So that the English could take the castles and then keep them, and then control the population through that. So what they did was they just started burning down their own castles, and that was the
Yeah.
mechanism by which they um, shook off England. And yeah, a couple hundred years later, that same family ended up being crowned the first Scottish kings of England,
Yes.
which was kind of a way to colonize them indirectly. But
Yes. And the Scots developed pike warfare for this, where they, the knights were the dominant medieval warfare style, and knights would ride on horseback with all this armor and charge people and destroy them. And it was nigh impossible to beat a knight charge. And the reason medieval Europe was an aristocracy was the military structure incentivized basically training these guys really hard from childhood because their armor and their horse was so expensive. But the Scots developed the pike, and the pike gradually spread around Europe to kill the knight because these Scottish peasants with spears could fight off the English, and that shocked them. The English, in turn, developed the longbow to fight against the Scots, where the longbow was this. It was this kind of bow they had used on the Welsh borderlands fighting against the Welsh. And the longbow requires so much muscle power, it's just not even funny. And there was a system in the Hundred Years' War, and we'll get to the Hundred Years' War, where the English had a draft where all free men in England had to study with the longbow for 4 hours a week every week to get their muscles to be strong enough to use the longbow. And the longbow was just this incredibly powerful weapon that wiped out so many armies. It was almost like a medieval version of the Gatling gun, and the English were able to use the longbow to wipe out a Scottish pike army at Falkirk, where the Scots were able to ultimately defeat them. And when we get to the Hundred Years' War, you'll see the longbow really kill a lot of people, but we've done bioanalysis of the bodies of longbowmen, and their muscle and bone structure is literally different from us due to the amount of muscle strain required to pull back the longbow.
which explains why the French adopted the crossbow so readily, because it
Yes.
was the only way to catch up quickly.
Yes.
Because you spend 10 years of training.
And the issue with the French as well is the French didn't have a big enough middle class to arm them, where the French over relied on cavalry warfare because they had this huge, really aggressive nobility, and England had this property owning middle class. And this leads seamlessly to the Hundred Years' War, where the dynastic clusterfuck of medieval politics resulted in over a century war between the English and the French monarchy. Because keep in mind, the King of England often owned more of France than the King of France did, and the King of England was a king in his own right, while at the same time, the King of France was the liege lord of the King of England because the King of England was the Lord of Normandy, which was part of France. So both kings had the legal right to preempt each other in different situations. And there was a dynastic issue with the French monarchy. And the Hundred Years' War deserves its own video, so I'm going to be sparing here. But the Hundred Years' War was a series of sub-wars over a 115-year period, starting around 1340 and ending around 1450. And the Hundred Years' War was this stalemate between the English's incredible ability with the longbow and the French's massive demographic power. Because France on paper had 4 times England's population, but their actual coffers was the English king could raise as much money as the King of France because England was much better organized. And France was also in civil war where Europe faced this horrifying crisis in the 1300s called the Black Death, which killed half of the region's population. In Normandy, it killed 2/3 of the population. And in France as a whole, France ended the 15th century with 2/3 less people at the start of the 14th century. And
Insane.
it was really brutal, where the King of France had to fight off the English. Then there was a civil war in France between the Armagnacs and the Burgundians. Then there was a peasant revolt called the Jacqueries. And then you had the English attacking the sides of France. So the English were basically picking France apart, trying to get it to fall apart due to its own social collapse. And the English were able to displace their own civil war for a century by just raping France. For over a century, the English had almost no political problems except for Hotspur's rebellion because all of their young men, all of their most aggressive young men were sicked on France all the time to just steal stuff from France. And
Right.
this
It's
was
essentially Viking raiding
exactly,
using English population.
yeah. This was literally a political move of the time where the King of England refused to go to war and the nobility threatened to mutiny. because they said, no, you have to go to
Mhm.
war because we need to make some money. And
Right. They had commercial interests in the very
exactly.
valuable, sheep farms and everything in
Yeah.
northern France.
Yeah. And
Um,
the
and
wine
then,
trade,
yeah,
the wine
I was
trade
just
was,
going to say how it kind of wrapped up was the Kentish peasant revolt,
yes.
which ties back to that comment you mentioned about the English being able to collect a lot more taxes for the war.
Yeah. Yeah.
So their population getting fed up with the high taxes through this organized system eventually was the tipping point. So the same thing
Yes.
that gave them the advantage, eventually they were not able to maintain
Yeah.
that high level. There were revolts over the poll tax.
In the 1380s, you had the Peasant Rebellion, which you're talking about, which is the Black Death halved England's population, and so wages skyrocketed, and the
Mm.
old nobility structure couldn't handle it. And so England was making this transition from a feudal economy to a capitalist economy. And England broke through serfdom in the 13 and 1400s, which was the best thing England did because it allowed the opening of a free labor market. And the English monarchy stopped this, where they did stuff like they banned peasants from leaving their lord, or they banned peasants from wearing nice clothing, but none of it worked. The innate force of capitalism forced the English to adapt to a new system. And what happened is that the peasants in Kent rebelled, and they had an early version of Protestantism called the Lollards, where they supported reading the Bible for yourself in English, and they seized London, and then the English nobility invited their leader to a business meeting and then killed him, which is not cool. And then they destroyed the rebels, but then the English monarchy, after killing the rebels, had to give the English peasants all the concessions the rebels asked for, which is not an uncommon thing in history. Oftentimes, when you crush a revolt, you have to give the rebels what they wanted anyway to not have them, to make them rulable. And for the final parts of the French War, and again, Hundred Years' War is its own thing. The English were able to launch these stunning victories against the French, outnumbered 3 or 4 to 1. You have Agincourt, you have Crécy, you have a third one. I think it's in Poitiers. It's just as impressive, where these English longbows took on these French armies and just slaughtered them. Again, the knight was the tank of the battlefield, and these longbowmen could take them out. And it was and the French literally resorted to guerrilla warfare under the leader of Bertrand de Guesclin, who was a Breton, where they knew they couldn't attack the English head on, but at the same time they needed to fight the war, so they dragged the English into the countryside, and the English literally burned most of southwest France as a strategy to hurt the French, because the English thought, if we just burn as much of the French economy as possible, the French can't fight. And this is a really, really brutal war. I can't overstate that. And what happened finally is that there was a weird treaty agreement where Henry V of England would have inherited the throne of France if he lived long enough, because the French monarchy had given up. And what happened is that Henry V, who was a Chad, he died too early, and thus the French voided the deal. But then the English invaded France. They were to take the top third of France, and then what happened is that the French had kind of given up as a society. They had the men, they had the money, but their monarch was a literal schizophrenic who believed he was made out of glass. And Joan of Arc, this 16-year-old peasant girl, showed up, said she was sent by God. She passed all of the scientific tests they had at the time, whether you're connected to God. They'd ask you obscure theological questions or obscure private questions at the king's life, and she knew all of it. And Joan of Arc was able to launch the resistance and wipe out the English armies. And her collective will is what gave the French people the force to fight back, because the French were so exhausted. And we forget that the English were actively trying to settle France, because over the course of the Hundred Years' War, the French-speaking elite had assimilated. So all of English was English-speaking, and the Hundred Years' War is what gave modern England its nationalism. Because modern authors like to say that nationalism is a recent industrial discovery, but no, we have lots of ancient and medieval records of nationalism. And the concept of Englishness and Frenchness stems from the 1300s and the Hundred Years' War. And the English literally had settlers to populate Normandy in the north of France. And I call them often proto-Americans because they were these longbow, hardy middle-class types. and they got driven out of France. And the French victory, which ultimately ended in 1453, which is one of the most important years in history because it's also when Constantinople fell, with the fall of Bordeaux and the last city in Gascony to the French. And the loss in France precipitated the Hundred Years' War, where the English had become so addicted to raping France for money that the second they could no longer rape France, England immediately spiraled into civil war because they had all these aggro young guys who had to fight each other. And so you had the Lancastrians and the Yorkists fight each other over England's throne because there was the Duke of York, who was a quite capable military dictator, and the king was a Lancastrian who was kind of stupid, and his wife was very capable, though, Margaret of Anjou. The Wars of the Roses isn't really a worthwhile thing for me to teach you. It's too complicated. You're not going to get anything real out of it. These English noble families killed each other. They cycled between running the country and fleeing to France, and they came back. After a century of not that bad wars, England was able to default onto the Tudor monarchy, which were ethnically French and Welsh, who were able to fully unify England in 1488 to become a modern country. And that is medieval England, or medieval Britain.
Perfect. A- And then I guess the other analysis throughout that period, now that we've, talked about the political changes
Yeah.
and everything, what were the technological changes throughout their
Yes.
period? What was the wealth and advancement compared to the
Yes.
pre-Roman period?
So
Yeah.
that's a good question. Where the period where I would say they had caught up with the Romans was around 1250. And I also put 1250 as the year that Western civilization surpassed any others. Because Marco Polo did go to China in that time period and said China was more advanced. But also, it's one of those things that he wasn't assessing West Europe for its strengths because they weren't easy to spot. Where Western civilization was able to get mechanically very advanced, they had clockwork, they had machinery. They had an incredibly advanced philosophy. They had the scientific method. The scientific method was developed in a lot of ways by English monks in the 1300s. England was vastly disproportionate for science and for philosophy in this time period. You had a vast advanced economy that had a stock market. You had a university system. You had an advanced concept of political philosophy. And so over this time period, you saw England gradually advance so that it reached a point where England was not one of the most important countries in Europe, but if you looked at human development stats, England would score as one of the highest places in the world. Where England wasn't the wealthiest place in the world at this
Yeah.
point, it was one of the wealthier countries in Europe, but it was still beat by Italy and the Dutch. But if you look at stuff like legal rights, if you look at stuff like just the society's level of functioning, national identity, I literally wrote an essay in high school saying 13th century England was a more developed society than 20th century Brazil.
Yeah. And there's a lot of other nuances in there, right? Because there was a lot of trading wealth in
Yeah.
Italy throughout that time.
Yes.
Um, but in terms of, comparing during the Roman period, growth was fairly stagnant.
Yes.
There was a lot of innovation and re-exploration of the classics, and you had the aqueducts and
Yes.
these big kind of projects, and then you had, engineering without the metal work to make it possible, but you had people mapping
Yeah.
out those concepts. But their their base society was pretty stagnant. There was no real sustained economic growth throughout the Roman period because most of their innovations, on the agricultural level, revolved around processing and getting more slaves.
Yes.
So the way they improved their farms was getting more slaves, and you see the historical GDP of Italy was a little bit higher than France,
Yeah.
but a lot of that was just tax extraction.
Yes.
And France pretty quickly passed up Italy in GDP. England was more kind of like on parity with
Yeah.
Italy in terms of farming technology, but the heavy plow was invented in the sixth, seventh century or incorporated crop rotation in the eighth
Yes.
century, tandem harnesses in the ninth century, horse collars in the ninth to tenth. that's a huge
Yeah.
innovation because previously you were farming only with oxen. So the dispersed technology level throughout even the early Middle Ages was much higher than Rome. And there were monks. Every monastery had a essentially factory connected to it that
Yeah.
was water powered. There
Hmm.
was a monk that flew a glider 600 feet in the year 1000 in England. Like
Yes.
these guys were up to serious stuff.
Yeah. They were clearly not stupid, which is people think of it. When people think of the Middle Ages, they think it's stupid, which it couldn't be further from the truth. And William of Ockham invented Occam's razor. He was a monk in the 1300s. Roger Bacon, a monk in the 1200s in England, he invented the concept of I think he invented the scientific method. He invented the concept of a steamship and a plane. He was talking about techno-futurism in the 1200s.
Yeah.
And Duns Scotus, a Scottish thinker, he was like a hyper-religious, submit to God guy, but he was one of the most important philosophers of medieval European history. And I'm not even mentioning all the important thinkers and philosophers from England in this time period. And I realized I forgot to talk about Ireland because the Scots solidified it into a kingdom that eventually drove the Norwegians out. And in Ireland, what happened is the English briefly took like half the country, and the English settlers from the 1100s period, they uh, they have become known as the old English now in Ireland because the Irish say that the old English settlers are now more Irish than the Irish. And so the English would have to pass legislation saying that you were not allowed to marry the native Irish if you were English because you would assimilate. And what happened is that, you know the term beyond the pale?
Yes.
So beyond the pale is a term because the area around Dublin was run by the English, and then the whole rest of Ireland reverted back to Irish control because whenever the English would push outwards, the Irish would push them back. And it's crazy to look at places like Ireland or Scotland that we see as wealthy first world countries, and these were decentralized tribal warrior places into the 1600s or the 1700s, very recently, because we view
Right.
white people as like innately uh, we don't conceptualize white people as barbarians, but there were lots of white
Indigenous or what?
barbarians.
Right. Um, and that speaks to your point about Scotland earlier,
Yeah,
where they weren't fully conquered until around the time of the American Revolution. And
yeah,
the reason for that is because it changed the incentives, where the American Revolution was largely a Scotch-Irish rebellion. So as long as they had somewhere to go where they could be free, it loosened the pressure on a domestic revolt. So
yeah,
now we're all over in America trying to get to Mars.
yeah. When you um when you read enough early modern and medieval history, you'll read about the nobility launching a 7-year war over a 0.5% tax increase, and you think, oh yeah, all those guys moved to America.
Right. And
So,
then yeah, the poll tax and everything. Yep.
anything else on this topic?
I guess just to reiterate how foundational some of the early conceptions of modern science were, even in Dark Age
Yes.
Europe. Like I think this was from the 600s or 700s. This was right after Rome, where they got this stuff off of Britannic buildings. So it wasn't
Yes.
recorded records, but they could see it carved in the stone. And they had like arithmetic as static number,
Yeah.
music as moving number, astrology as rhetoric, language as math, and a lot of basically foundational ways that we conceptualize things today. And it's just part of that interesting dynamic where England didn't they had that long Roman presence,
Yes.
but because they were able to translate it and they had their own language, they didn't have anti-colonial syndrome where they rejected the ideas
Yes.
because they were in opposition, they were associated with the conqueror, like you
Yes.
see in a lot of Africa and the Soviets.
Leftism
Mhm.
leftism, we have to end every video shitting on leftism,
Yes.
but leftism ends up hurting every group it claims to help because they abdicate responsibility for whatever group they're working with, which is the worst advice to give someone. Let's say you've got a cousin who's an alcoholic. You tell them, no, you should stop drinking. You don't tell them, oh, we're here to enable you in drinking. And A final point I want to end on is that this is the origin of our concept of freedom, because we forget that freedom is a concept that stems from the Middle Ages, and it stems from the northwest of Europe in the Middle Ages. And it was this emergent phenomena between the peasant revolts and the Magna Carta and the free cities and the parliament and the separation of church and state. But out of this society, an English person in 1400 is a person who you could understand. The point where English is comprehensible verbally to someone today is around 1400. Actually, you could go back to 1300 and still be comprehensible to someone in medieval England. And this person would have similar ideas about personal freedom. They would have similar concepts about moral values as you, where once you get to the 1400s, you have people talking about. There is a line in the peasant revolt that goes, "Where was the Lord and where was the peasant when Adam and Eve were there?" And what that's basically saying is that our social structure is a social construct, and that's a pretty advanced idea. And so, for the next video, do you want to cover ancient Europe, the Silk Road, or pre-colonial Southeast Asia?
Let's do ancient Europe to keep on theme.
Yes.
And then I guess I would point out one last point about the Celts' attempt to be free and infighting is the story of King Arthur was supposedly about the fight against the Saxons, but the main enemy was like Arthur's relative. They didn't even get to the Saxons. The whole fight was, can we not fight each other? And then
Yeah.
winning is automatic.
That's hilarious.
So, yeah, we'll see how that goes in
Okay.
America.
Well, catch you next time for Ancient Europe. Pleasure as always. Peace.